Are Filipinos Asians or Pacific Islanders? Yes and no. Neither. And both. If you're confused, then you're not the only one. Growing up in the Philippines, we knew we were Asians. The Philippines is literally in Southeast Asia. Filipinos are pioneers of so many Pan-Asian things, from ASEAN to the Asian Games. It wasn't even a debate, and to be honest, I was never confused. But when I moved to the US, suddenly, things were not so clear. Nothing was black and white. In high school, as a teenager in Los Angeles, I'd hear all kinds of questions. Are Filipinos even Asians? But wait, aren't you Pacific Islanders? People were not always sure where to place us. I mean, even the US government throughout history couldn't seem to agree where we belong. For example, on official forms, I've seen Filipino listed under Asian, usually. But sometimes, we are also grouped with Pacific Islanders. And that's when I realized that this is not just a question of geography. It is about identity. It's about power and about how empire, colonialism, and racism have shaped how we are seen and how we see ourselves. So, how exactly did we get here? And why does it even matter? Mabuhay! Or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo! Welcome to my channel, it's me Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. Today we're diving deep into one of the most debated yet often misunderstood questions that have always been asked for the past 20 years. Are Filipinos Asians or Pacific Islanders? In this video, we're going to break down where that question even came from and how the US government has historically used racial categories not just to describe people but to control them. For Filipinos, those labels were not always about identity. A lot of times, they were used to bypass racist laws, exclusionary laws against Asian immigrants, while still making it easier to exploit Filipino labor, Filipino workers. That is why this is not just about geography. It is about how we've been defined as a people, often for someone else's benefit. Now, this is not the first time that I've talked about this topic in the past 20 years. In fact, I even made a video about this a decade ago. But this updated and expanded version goes even deeper into unpacking this question. I'll be sharing from my perspective as a historian who specializes in ethnic studies, and as a culture bearer who was raised on both sides of the Pacific. Today's video is based on both research and real-life lived experiences. So let's dive in. Now, if you look at the map, it seems pretty obvious. Our motherland is located in Southeast Asia. But if it is so clear and quite obvious, then why do so many people, including Filipinos in the motherland and in the diaspora, still debate this? Why are so many Filipino Americans still confused? Let us start with geography. The Philippines is literally one of the biggest countries in Southeast Asia. And that is not just a trivia or a classroom fact. It is a geopolitical reality. For example, we're a founding member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. We've hosted the Asian Games. We're even home to the Asian Development Bank, often called as Asia's version of the IMF or the World Bank. And when it comes to global diplomacy and trade, we're consistently grouped with other Asian countries like Indonesia, China, Malaysia, Japan, India, Taiwan, and others. In fact, the Philippines has long played a central role in Pan-Asian institutions and events, serving as a key site for regional, cultural, academic, and economic exchange. Our place in Asia was never doubted or debated. And geographically, our 7,641 islands also sit right on the edge of the Pacific, just like Japan, which is part of why that line between Asia and the Pacific has always been blurry. In fact, Japan, the Philippines, and countries like Mexico are also recognized as Pacific nations in modern-day geopolitics and global economics. But here's where it gets tricky. Being an island nation in the Pacific does not automatically make you a Pacific Islander. And here's where context is key. In US racial categories, Pacific Islanders refers specifically to the peoples from Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, like Native Hawaiians, Samoans, Tongans, Chamorros, and so many others. It is not just about being from an island in the Pacific. It is about cultural and historical context. And that is where the confusion starts. Not because Filipinos don't know where we came from, but because American systems have never been consistent with how they defined us. And you'll see why and what I mean in just a little bit. If geography puts us in Asia, then culture will make things even more interesting. Because if you look at our roots, our languages, our traditions, our ancestors, then it's pretty clear that we don't belong to just one side of the ocean. Filipinos come from Austronesian roots, a vast family of diverse indigenous peoples from Madagascar in Africa to Hawaii in the Pacific and all the way to Easter Island in Chile. Linguistically, we are part of the Malayo-Polynesian group within the umbrella of Austronesian languages, meaning that Tagalog, Cebuano, Kapampangan, and so many others are the elder cousins of the languages spoken in places like Samoa, Fiji, and Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand. And that is why so many of our traditions, like seafaring, indigenous tattoos, oral traditions, like storytelling, and communal values, echo the cultures of the diverse Pacific Islanders. And at the same time, we've always had deep connections with Asia. Long before colonialism, our ancestors traded with India, China, and of course Southeast Asia and the Arab world. In fact, our early indigenous pre-colonial societies were shaped by Hindu-Buddhist influences, Chinese culture, and Islamic sultanates from Borneo to Mindanao. Our ancient geopolitics have always been interconnected with our Southeast Asian neighbors. Like literally, our datus and rajas were blood related to the rulers of Brunei, Sumatra, Moluccas, Java, and beyond. Then came Spanish colonialism, which didn't just bring the Catholic Church and Hispanic surnames, but tied us even deeper across the Pacific Ocean to Latin America through the global Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. And that is why many of our Filipino food, faith, and even fiestas can sometimes feel more Latino than Asian. And on top of this, modern genetic and archaeological research shows that Pacific Islanders, especially Micronesians and Polynesians, trace a direct line of ancestry to what is now the Philippines. These findings reveal just how interwoven our heritage really is. We're culturally connected and related to both Asia and Oceania, literally a bridge between Asians and Pacific Islanders. So, if geography and culture are quite clear, then why is there still so much confusion and debate to this day in 2025? I mean, no one ever questions if the Japanese or the Indonesians are Asians or Pacific Islanders. And if you think about it, no one even asks if the UK is Atlantic Islanders and not Europeans. But when it comes to Filipinos, then suddenly everything is a debate. And here's why. In the US, some Filipino Americans may sometimes identify as Pacific Islanders, sparking debate online, and let's be honest, sometimes even hateful backlash from Filipinos in the motherland, accusing those in the diaspora with ignorance, with stupidity, accusing them of not knowing anything about being Filipino. And too often, that anger is aimed at the individual without understanding the deeper history or how American systems created the confusion in the first place. So to understand where this all began, we need to go back to the early 1900s, after the brutal and bloody Filipino American War. The United States had just taken control of the Philippines, and suddenly they had to figure out what to do with millions of Filipinos, with millions of new colonial subjects. In the eyes of Uncle Sam, Filipinos were not classified as aliens, but they were not citizens either. Instead, the US government labeled us US nationals. It was a legal gray area, and unknown to many, it wasn't really about identity, it was about labor. During this time, the United States was banning immigration from Asian countries through racist exclusion laws. But Filipinos, as so-called US nationals, could still be brought in as cheap labor and exploitable workers to places like Hawaii, Alaska, and California without technically violating their own racist laws. In fact, by the 1920s and the 1930s, Filipinos had become one of the largest populations of migrant workers in the US, especially in agriculture, canneries, and plantations. Now on paper, we were not officially labeled as Pacific Islanders in US racial categories. But let's be real, historically the Philippines was often grouped with the Pacific Islands. And for decades in the US, the Philippines went by the initials PI before the modern day PH. And that idea was baked into everything: school books, maps, military records, government agencies, and more. But after the Philippines gained independence from the US in 1946, we were quietly shifted under the Asian label, just another convenient reclassification by the same racist system that never fully knew what to do with us, apart from exploiting us. These were not just classification changes on paper, these were tools of economic and political control. So, who actually decides these labels? Asians, Pacific Islanders, others? Spoiler alert, it's not geography, it's the government. And when it comes to race in America, it's almost never neutral. In the US, racial categories have never been just about describing people. They've always been used to control access, like who gets to immigrate, who gets to work, and who gets to belong. As early as 1790, the Naturalization Act limited citizenship and rights to quote-unquote free white persons. Then in 1924, the Immigration Act banned most Asians entirely, but of course apart from Filipinos who were officially US nationals. And every step of the way, the definitions of race were changed, stretched, bent, or reworded to keep that control in place, to keep white supremacy in power. Unknown to many, Filipinos were constantly redefined depending on what benefits the US economy. When labor was needed, Filipinos were US nationals. When exclusion was the goal, when they wanted to ban Asian immigrants, then suddenly we were not Asians either. And when the Philippines gained independence, they lumped us back under the Asian umbrella, and thus limiting our immigration. And these changes were done without any real conversation about what this means for our communities. And this constantly changing definition and redefinition is not limited to Filipinos. Other migrant communities have experienced the same thing. In fact, it wasn't even until 1997 that the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, finally created a separate racial category for Native Hawaiians or other Pacific Islanders in the census and federal data. That's very recent, literally within our lifetime. So if you ask Uncle Sam, are Filipinos Asians or Pacific Islanders? The honest answer has always been whatever is more convenient for America, whatever Uncle Sam needs Filipinos for. When Uncle Sam keeps changing our racial category, it doesn't just affect the forms we fill out. It starts to mess with our own understanding. It starts to mess with how we see ourselves and how others see us, or even how we treat others. And at some point, identity stops being just personal or about heritage. It becomes political. It becomes about survival and impact. The truth is, identity is not fixed. It is layered, fluid, and deeply personal, especially for those in the diaspora. Filipino Americans might feel a strong connection to Asian, Pacific, Indigenous, or Latino communities, or to all of them. And those feelings of closeness are valid, even if that connection does not necessarily mean claiming those identities. And over time, generations of Filipino Americans grew up in the Pacific Islands, like in Hawaii and Guam, where our communities have deeper roots, going back over a century. It is no surprise that many Phil-Ams feel closer to Pacific Islander cultures than to Asian ones. That sense of belonging is not imagined. It is not out of ignorance. It is rooted in real lived experiences and deeper history. But don't get me wrong, identity also comes with responsibility, because in systems like the US Census, healthcare, and education, checking the box for Pacific Islanders can have real consequences. It can unintentionally inflate population numbers, and that can divert the already limited resources away from Pacific Islander communities like Native Hawaiians, Samoans, Tongans, Chamorros, and more, who are often fighting just to be seen in policies and data. We have entire studies on Pacific health equity and the impacts of the census that shows how this plays out, from funding to visibility and even life expectancy. So while we embrace our shared Austronesian roots, we also need to stand in solidarity and not contribute to the erasure of our Pacific Islander cousins. So if you're Filipino or Phil-Am, and if you've ever marked Pacific Islander in the census or any official forms, you are not entirely wrong to feel that connection. But it is worth asking, who else is being counted or erased because of it? Throughout history, we've been called Asians or Pacific Islanders. Sometimes both, sometimes neither. But here's the truth. We've always belonged to more than just one story, more than just one category. And it is time that we stop letting others define us, letting others limit our identities. We are Southeast Asians, we're Austronesians, we're diverse, and many of us carry indigenous roots. We've always held more than just one identity, and that fluidity is not something to shrink into a single box. It is something to uplift and embrace. But owning that complexity, that fluidity, also means recognizing the realities we live in. In the US, when people hear Asian, most would automatically think of East Asians, like the Chinese or the Japanese. The reality is that they're the ones most visible in the media, more likely to be prioritized in funding, and more often represented in leadership or public policy. Meanwhile, other Asians like Southeast Asians, including Filipinos, are often included on paper, but forgotten in practice. Filipinos are rarely seen as the face of being Asian, even when we are the largest population in the room. Today, Filipinos are the second largest Asian American population in the US. In fact, unknown to many, until the 1980s, Filipino Americans were actually the largest. Nevertheless, we are also the oldest continuous Asian American community, dating back to the 1700s, when the Manila men established the settlement of St. Malo in Louisiana. And even earlier, Luzones Indios landed in Morro Bay back in 1587, marking the first recorded presence of Asians in what is now the continental United States. In fact, many missions and early towns along the coast of California were built with Filipino labor, particularly the Luzones Indios de la Pampanga. Yet, even with this deep history, and even when we're counted as Asians, we're not always seen or treated as Asians, or even Asian enough. Now on the flip side, when we are labeled as Pacific Islanders, it can unintentionally take space and resources away from native Pacific Islander communities who are still fighting to be seen. And for Filipinos back home in the motherland, this still matters. These labels don't just stay on paper or just stay in the US. They follow us around the world. For example, they shape how we're treated in immigration lines, what gets written in school textbooks, and whose voices get heard on the global stage, like in Hollywood. So whether Filipinos were boxed in, left out, or mislabeled, our story does not end there. Because no matter where we fall on the map, no matter our racial category, our stories have always been bigger than a label. Our roots have always been deeper than the census, and bigger than any box Uncle Sam tried to put us in. So never let anyone diminish who you are. Be proud, be complex, be fluid, and more importantly, stand in solidarity, not just for inclusion, but for justice. Because knowing about who we are, knowing about our past, where we came from, understanding our roots, that is only the beginning. And what we do with that knowledge, what we choose to do with that truth, with that wisdom, that is how we move forward, together, towards a brighter future, towards a better society. So, are we Filipinos Asians or Pacific Islanders? Maybe the better question is, who gets to decide? Because our identities have always been layered, have always been complex, colorful, and fluid. And that is not a problem to be fixed. That is a truth to be embraced. Now growing up, I didn't have all the answers, but I had this song, Kaleidoscope World by Francis M, by the great master rapper Kiko Magalona. It was a big song back in the 90s, and it truly helped me make sense of identity, of diversity in society, long before I even had words for them. And it goes something like this. I don't want to get copyrighted, so please bear with me while I sing parts of the song. Every color and every hue is represented by me and you. Take a slide in the slope. Take a look in the kaleidoscope. Spin it around, make it twirl in this kaleidoscope world. Our stories were never meant to fit just one box. They were never meant to be limited to one category. And that is precisely what makes our identities beautiful and powerful. If you find this video insightful, don't forget to watch my other videos and subscribe to my channel to learn more about our people's histories, cultures, and everything in between. And if you want to dig even deeper, I've also written several books all about reclaiming and uplifting the narratives of our ancestors, the stories of our people. So check them out in the links below. Maraming salamat po, Orin Kapampangan. Dakal pong salamat kay Kongan and Bicolano. Diyos mabalos. See you next time. Orin Tagalog kita kits and Kapampangan. Mikitix and Binisaya. Kita ay ta.